Inside a silent penthouse, still grieving a loss it could not name, a 7-year-old boy clutched the only object that still carried his mother's voice, and it had just gone quiet forever. The most expensive technicians in the city had already given up. The powerful billionaire who now raised him simply wanted to replace it with something newer, something better. Then a black man in a worn maintenance uniform stepped forward and said quietly, "I can make this right again." No one in the room believed him, not until the voice they thought was lost returned. The penthouse occupied the top 3 floors of a glass tower on the Upper West Side, and most evenings it felt less like a home than a museum that had forgotten what it was meant to display. Victoria Hale had bought it 11 years ago, back when she was still building the company that would later be valued in the billions. She had chosen it for the view, for the privacy, and for the specific kind of silence that only altitude could buy. Lately, that silence had begun to weigh more than the rest of the building. 6 months had passed since the accident on the Sawmill River Parkway. 6 months since a state trooper had called Victoria in the middle of a board meeting and told her in a voice trained to be gentle that her younger sister Claire would not be coming home. 6 months since a quiet, hollow-eyed 7-year-old named Noah had been placed in her care because no one else in the family was willing or capable, and because Claire had named her in the will without ever asking whether she wanted the role. Victoria did not know how to be anyone's mother. She knew how to run quarterly reviews. She knew how to read a balance sheet at 30,000 feet. She knew how to fire a man twice her age and still sleep through the night. But she did not know what to do with the boy who sat at the far end of her dining table each morning, picking at toast he did not eat, looking at her with eyes that seemed to be waiting for something she could not give him. He carried the robot everywhere. It was an older model, the kind of thing a child might have begged for 2 Christmases ago, and then outgrown silver-blue plastic scuffed at the joints with a small speaker grill in its chest. Claire had given it to him for his 5th birthday. What no one outside the immediate family knew, and what Victoria herself only half understood, was that Claire had done something to it after the fact. She had opened it up at her kitchen table and modified it. Inside that scuffed little chassis lived dozens of recordings of Claire's voice, bedtime greetings, fairy tales she had invented on the fly, private messages meant for Noah's ears alone. He pressed the button on its back the way other children might pet a dog. Victoria did not ask which recordings he listened to. She suspected she did not have the right. There was a room in the penthouse 2 doors down from Noah's that Victoria had not entered more than twice since the funeral. It had been Claire's study during the months she and Noah had stayed there after the divorce, and Victoria had simply closed the door and let it remain a closed door. On a desk inside that room sat a leather-bound notebook with a fraying corner and a small stack of framed diplomas leaning against the wall, a bachelor's in electrical engineering, a master's in embedded systems, a certificate from a medical device firm in Boston, where Claire had worked for 6 years before leaving to raise Noah on her own. Victoria had always considered that decision a waste. A woman with credentials like that walking away to read picture books out loud. She had said as much more than once at Thanksgiving dinners that now felt like a different lifetime. The notebook had been on the desk the day of the funeral, and it was still on the desk now. Victoria had glanced at it exactly once, lifted the cover an inch, and closed it again. There were limits to what she was prepared to know. 3 floors down in the staff corridor behind the service elevators, a man named Elijah Carter spent most of his working hours invisible. He was in his early 40s, broad-shouldered, with hands that bore the small white scars of a man who had been working with metal and circuitry since he was a teenager. His uniform was the building's standard gray, and his name tag said only Carter Maintenance in plain block letters. Residents passed him in hallways without seeing him. That suited him fine. 15 years before Elijah had been a senior hardware engineer at a medical device firm outside Boston. He had specialized in the kind of low-level board work that most people no longer learn to do by hand. When his wife Denise was diagnosed with stage 3 breast cancer in the spring of the year, their daughter Maya turned 5, he had taken a leave. When Denise died 14 months later, he had not gone back. The job had required travel. Maya had needed a father who came home at the same time every night. So he had taken the first steady position he could find that offered a fixed schedule and a school district within walking distance, and he had told no one in the building what he used to do for a living. He kept a small set of jeweler's screwdrivers in his shirt pocket out of habit. His toolkit, which he carried with him on every shift, was 30 years old and arranged with the kind of precision that only a certain kind of person ever bothered with. In the penthouse above on a Tuesday evening in October, the robot stopped working. Noah had been sitting on the floor of his room back against the bed frame the way he sat every night now. He had pressed the button. He had been listening to one of the longer recordings, Claire reading him a story about a fox who had lost his shadow and gone looking for it across 7 hills. He had reached the part where the fox sat down to rest, and the voice had broken into a soft mechanical click, and then nothing. He pressed the button again. Nothing. The sound that came out of him when he realized was not a scream exactly. It was the sound a child makes when something inside him understands faster than his thinking can, that a door has just closed. Victoria was in her office at the other end of the floor on a video call with 2 attorneys in London when she heard him in the hallway. He was pounding on her door. He had not done that once in 6 months. She opened it and found him holding the robot with both hands, the way someone might hold a wounded animal, and she did not need him to explain. Within 40 minutes, she had 3 engineers from her own company standing in her living room. They were good. She paid them to be. They worked on the robot for nearly 2 hours while Noah sat on the sofa, knees pulled to his chest, watching every movement of every hand. The lead engineer, a man named Marcus Daniels, finally straightened up and gave Victoria the look she had been dreading. "The main board is failing in a way we can't diagnose," Marcus told her. "Honestly, ma'am, the architecture inside this thing is strange. It's been modified. Whatever your sister did to it, she didn't document it. We can pull whatever's still readable from the chip and migrate it to a new unit, but the original, there's nothing we can do." Noah was already crying. Quietly. He had learned how to cry quietly months ago. The engineers began to pack up. There is a particular way that the very wealthy are taught from childhood to handle pain. They are taught that every problem has a solution and that the solution can be purchased. A failing back is a specialist. A failing marriage is a discreet attorney. A failing child is a better school. The world Victoria Hale had built her life inside operated on this assumption the way a city operates on electricity. Pain that could not be outsourced was pain that did not officially exist. The problem was that grief did not follow the rules. Grief did not respect calendars or invoices or non-disclosure agreements. It did not return calls, and it could not be delegated to an assistant. And when a person who had spent 30 years mastering the art of control finally encountered something she could not control, the most common response was not surrender, it was retreat. Back to the office, back to the spreadsheet, back to the one room in the building where she still felt like herself. Society called that toughness. Most of the time it was something else wearing a more flattering name. The engineers were already at the elevator when Elijah Carter stepped off it. He had been working in the corridor for the better part of the evening, replacing a faulty fixture in one of the ceiling panels, and through the half-open service door, he had heard the boy crying. He stood very still for a long moment with the screwdriver in his hand. Then he set down his tools, wiped his palms on the front of his uniform, and asked the housekeeper at the door whether he might take a look. The housekeeper, a woman named Doreen, who had worked for Victoria for 9 years, told him to go back to his floor. But Noah, through the gap in the doorway, had seen him. And Noah, who had not spoken voluntarily to a stranger in 6 months, sat up. Victoria came to the door because Doreen called her, and her first impression of the man in the corridor was made entirely of surfaces: the gray uniform, the scuffed work boots, the toolkit at his feet old enough that the leather corners had gone soft. She was polite. She was almost always polite. She thanked him and began to explain that her own team had just finished their assessment. That was when Noah spoke. "Aunt Victoria." His voice was small, but it carried. "I don't want a new one. I just want to hear Mom one more time." It was the longest sentence he had said to her in half a year. She turned back to Elijah, and she looked at him this time the way she might have looked at a colleague. "You're sure?" He did not promise her anything. He had learned over the course of one very long year never to promise a child something he could not absolutely deliver. He met her eyes and he said, "I'm not sure it can be saved, ma'am, but I'm fairly sure it isn't finished. Sometimes when a thing like this goes quiet, it's because it's trying to hold on to something inside itself." The engineers in the hallway exchanged a glance. Marcus Daniels opened his mouth and then closed it again. Victoria nodded once very slightly. "All right," she said. "Try." There is something I have always found striking about moments like this, the moments when a person who has trusted one system her whole life is asked with no warning to trust another. The more powerful she is, the harder the moment becomes, because trusting an instinct in a world built on credentials is also a quiet admission that credentials have a ceiling, and admitting a ceiling for a person who has spent her life climbing past them can feel more dangerous than losing the thing she is trying to save. I have seen people choose wrong in moments like that. I have seen them choose the safer answer and lose the more important one. So when Victoria stepped aside that night and let a man she did not know carry her nephew's grief over to the dining room table, I think she did something braver than she gave herself credit for. She did not yet know it. She would not know it for a long time. Later that evening, after the engineers had gone and Doreen had been politely dismissed, and the city outside the floor-to-ceiling windows had begun its slow shift into the deep blue hours, Victoria stood in the doorway of her own dining room and watched a stranger in a maintenance uniform set her nephew's robot down on a slab of imported marble. He did it the way a person sets down a sleeping infant. She did not know yet why she had agreed to this. Maybe because for the first time in 6 months, Noah had looked at someone without flinching. Sometimes what a grieving child needs most is not a better version of the thing he loves. Sometimes it is the simple sight of another person treating that thing as if it were still worth saving. And the older we get, the more often we forget that lesson until a child or a stranger is patient enough to teach it back to us. Elijah did not begin by opening the robot. He began by sitting down at the dining room table and simply looking at it. He turned it gently in his hands, traced the seam along its back. With the pad of his thumb, listened to the small sound it made when he tilted it sideways. He set it down. He moved it under the warm pool of light from the overhead fixture. Only then did he reach into his shirt pocket and take out the small leather case of jeweler's screwdrivers that had ridden against his chest for the better part of 3 decades. Victoria stood at the far end of the table and watched him from a distance she had not consciously chosen. Noah had migrated to the chair nearest Elijah, where he sat very still with both hands gripping the edge of the seat. Doreen, who had not been dismissed, and who clearly disapproved of her continued presence not being acknowledged, hovered near the kitchen archway with her arms crossed. Elijah asked, very politely, whether he could take the robot down to the small workshop in the service level where he kept his other tools. Victoria said no. Not unkindly, but firmly. She wanted to see what happened. She wanted to be in the room. Elijah accepted this without argument. He took a clean dish towel from the kitchen, folded it twice, and laid it across the marble before placing the robot on top of it. The towel was, Victoria realized later, for the marble's protection, not the toys. He began to remove the back panel with the kind of unhurried care that one usually associates with people who are aware they are being watched and have decided not to mind. The small screws came out one at a time and went into a shallow ceramic dish he had requested from the cabinet. Halfway through, one of them slipped from his fingers and pinged onto the marble, then onto the floor. It was the smallest possible mishap. A grown man, a single dropped screw on a slick stone surface, the kind of thing that happens in every garage in America 50 times a day. But Victoria's whole body tightened the way a violin string tightens, and before she could stop herself, she heard her own voice ask with an edge she did not entirely mean, "Are you sure you know what you're doing?" Doreen made a small sound near the archway that was not quite a laugh. Elijah did not look up immediately. He bent down, retrieved the screw, wiped it carefully with the corner of the dish towel, and placed it in the ceramic dish with the others. When he raised his eyes to Victoria's, his voice was as level as it had been in the hallway an hour earlier. "Mrs. Hale, I have taken apart this kind of board more than 1,000 times. My hands are unsteady because I know how much this matters to the boy, not because I don't know how." The words were spoken so softly that they had the strange effect of taking up more space in the room than if he had raised his voice. Doreen looked at the floor. Victoria, for the first time since the elevator doors had opened in her hallway, actually looked at the man at her dining table. Not at his uniform, not at the toolkit, at him. From the chair beside Elijah, Noah spoke up. His voice was thin but clear. "Aunt Victoria, let him keep going." She nodded once and stepped back. There is a particular cultural reflex in this country, and I think most of us know it whether or not we like to admit it. We have lost almost entirely the habit of repair. 2 or 3 generations ago, every household had at least one person who could mend a torn shirt, solder a loose connection in a lamp glue, the spine of a book back together plane, a sticking door. The skill was not glamorous. It did not require a degree. It only required time and the willingness to bend down close to a broken thing and listen to it for a while. We have replaced all of that with a single sentence. We'll get a new one. New cars when the old one rattles. New phones every September. New furniture when the cushion sags. The convenience is real. But the assumption has crept quietly into places it does not belong. New relationships when the old one disappoints us. New jobs when the old one demands too much. New beliefs when the old ones become inconvenient. There are things, though, that cannot be replaced. There are people who cannot be replaced. And the hands that still remember how to repair what most of us have learned to throw away are increasingly among the most valuable hands left in the country. Most of those hands are not wearing suits. Most of them are not being thanked. Most of them on most evenings are quietly underestimated by someone like Victoria Hale. It took Elijah nearly 2 hours to find what the engineers had missed. He worked through it the way an old surgeon works through a familiar incision, slow, methodical, mostly silent, occasionally murmuring to himself when his eyes caught something the rest of them could not see. He removed the back panel. He lifted out the small speaker assembly. He laid the inner board on the towel and turned the overhead light to its brightest setting. And at some point, the muscles around his jaw shifted in a way that Victoria, watching from across the table, almost missed. He had found something. He turned the board a quarter rotation so that the light caught it differently, and then he set down his screwdriver, took a small jeweler's loop from his pocket, and bent very close to the surface. "Mrs. Hale," he said without looking up. "May I ask who built this for him?" "His mother." Who was she professionally? Victoria felt the question travel into a part of her chest she had been keeping closed for half a year. She was an engineer, embedded systems. She worked for a medical device company in Massachusetts before Noah was born. Elijah nodded once slowly, as if confirming something he had already suspected. "There is a second chip on this board," he said, "that does not belong to the original factory design. Someone added it, by hand. The soldering is excellent, I would say better than most of the work I did when I did this for a living. Whoever built it knew exactly what they were doing." He looked at Noah, then at Victoria. "Your sister did not just record her voice into a toy. She built a custom architecture into it so that the recordings would be protected even if the main board failed. That's why your engineers couldn't read it. Their equipment was looking for a standard layout. This isn't standard." Victoria's hand found the back of the nearest chair and held on to it. She thought of the leather notebook on the desk in the closed room. She thought of the diplomas leaning against the wall. She thought of every conversation in which she had ever told Claire with the casual confidence of an older sister who had always known better that she was wasting herself. Elijah adjusted the small chip with a movement so small Victoria nearly missed it, then reseated a hair-thin wire that had pulled loose from its connector. He set the board back into the chassis. He replaced the speaker. He did not screw the back panel down, yet he simply pressed it into place and held it there with one steady hand. "Try it," he said to Noah. Noah reached out and pressed the button on the robot's chest. For one full second, nothing happened. Then there was the soft, mechanical click that Noah had heard every night of his life, and then a woman's voice came out of the small speaker, warm, slightly amused, alive, in the way that only a recorded voice from a person you have lost can be alive. "Hey, sweet boy. If you're listening to this, it means I'm probably in the other room. Or maybe I had to step out for a little while. But I'm thinking about you. Always." Noah did not move. He did not cry yet. He simply sat with his hands on the edge of the chair and listened to his mother's voice fill a room she had never been inside. Victoria put her hand over her mouth. Elijah stepped back from the table very deliberately, the way a man steps back from a fire he has just gotten going, so that the people who need the warmth can come closer. He picked up his toolkit. He did not say anything. He understood in a way that the 3 engineers from the company had not understood, that this moment did not belong to him. The robot played for another 40 seconds. When the recording ended, Noah finally moved. He climbed off the chair and walked without a word to Elijah, and he wrapped his arms around the man's waist and pressed his face against the gray uniform shirt. Doreen in the archway was crying quietly into the cuff of her sleeve. The moment the toy worked again, the entire purpose of the story shifted. No one in that room said it out loud, but they all felt it. It was no longer about a broken piece of plastic and a stranger from the maintenance floor. It was about the last words of a woman who had spent years quietly preparing for a future she could not have known was coming. It was about a 7-year-old boy who, for the first time in 6 months, was being held by a grown man who was not afraid of his grief. It was about a billionaire standing in her own dining room and discovering that she had not understood her own sister at all. Over the following days, Elijah came back. He had not been asked to in any formal way. Victoria had simply the next morning found him in the staff corridor and told him that she would arrange with the building's facilities office for his hours to be reallocated. He could come up to the penthouse whenever he was able. There were other things of Claire's that needed looking at: a small digital photo frame in the closed room, a story clock that had belonged to Noah's nursery, a recorder shaped like a wooden bird. All of them, Elijah confirmed when he examined them, had been quietly modified by the same hand. He never came up empty-handed. He brought a different toolkit each visit depending on what he expected to find. He brought a slim notebook of his own in which he sketched the architecture of each device as he uncovered it. He brought patience, which was something the household had been short on for half a year. The change in Noah happened in small pieces, the way most real changes do. One morning, Victoria came down the back stairs into the kitchen and stopped in the doorway because she could hear something she had not heard since Claire died. Noah was laughing, not loudly. A small laugh, the kind a child makes when an adult has said something gently absurd. Elijah was sitting across from him at the breakfast bar, a cup of black coffee in his hand and a plate of toast between them, and he was telling Noah a story about a raccoon that had once gotten into the basement of the building and held up traffic in the service elevator for nearly an hour. Victoria did not walk in. She stood at the edge of the doorway and listened and did not let herself be seen. She felt something move in her chest that she had not let move in a long time. She went back upstairs and sat at the foot of her own bed for 10 minutes without doing anything at all. A few afternoons later, the elevator chimed in the foyer and a small girl with 2 careful braids stepped out holding a hardcover book against her chest like a shield. Maya was 9.5. She had her father's careful eyes and her mother's high forehead, although Victoria did not yet know that. Doreen had been told to expect her. Elijah had asked very politely whether his daughter might come up after school on the days he was working in the penthouse. He had explained that his usual arrangement with a neighbor had fallen through that week and that Maya was old enough to sit quietly with a book in a corner if there was a corner to sit in. Victoria had said, of course, more easily than she expected to. Noah, who had been sitting on the rug in the living room with the robot in his lap, looked up when Maya came in. He did not say anything. Neither did she. She walked over, set her book on the coffee table, sat down on the rug, a respectful arm's length away from him, and began to read. After about 20 minutes, Noah spoke. "My mom died." Maya turned a page. "Mine too." "How long?" "4 years." "6 months." She looked at him then with the calm of a child who has been carrying a fact much longer than most adults realize children can carry facts. "It gets a little easier," she said. "Not all the way, but a little." They went back to their separate, quiet activities. Noah picked up a colored pencil from the low table and began to draw on the back of an envelope. After a while, Maya leaned over to look at what he was drawing. He let her. She picked up a second pencil and added a small house to the corner of his picture. He did not protest. Victoria watched from the hallway outside the living room without going in. She thought about her sister. She thought about the years she had spent prioritizing board meetings over phone calls. She thought about a Christmas 3 years ago when Claire had asked her to come up to the cabin for a long weekend, and she had said she could not get away. She thought about the fact that Noah had needed another child who understood, and that the child she had not been able to provide had walked through her front door in 2 braids carrying a library book. There is a kind of story about single fathers that almost never gets told in this country, and it is the quiet one. The one without crisis. The one where a man simply gets up every morning and packs a lunchbox and braids a child's hair badly at first, then a little better, and shows up at parent-teacher conferences as the only man in the room and pretends he does not notice the looks. We have a respectful word for a woman who loses her husband. We do not have one for a man who loses his wife and chooses to make himself smaller so that his daughter can stay safe. The single fathers I have known share one trait regardless of background or income or where they live. They learn a kind of softness that the culture has not given them permission to learn. They learn it anyway. They sit on the floor for tea parties they do not understand. They learn the names of cartoon characters they will never need to know again. They show up. They keep showing up. They are mocked for it almost as often as they are admired, and they keep doing it. Elijah Carter was that kind of father. None of the people in the penthouse knew this yet about him, but Maya knew it, and Maya was the only audience that mattered to him. One night, well past 11, Victoria came downstairs for a glass of water and found Elijah on the small terrace off the kitchen. The penthouse opened onto a wraparound balcony with a view of the river, and he was standing at the railing with his hands resting on the iron, looking out at the dark water and the small, bright shape of a tugboat moving against it. She had not meant to disturb him. She nearly turned around. Instead, she crossed the kitchen, filled a second glass with water, and brought it out to him. He took it and thanked her quietly. She had not in 6 months asked another person a personal question that had not been part of an organized condolence. The words came out almost without permission. "Do you still miss your wife?" He did not look at her right away. He looked at the river for a while. When he answered, his voice was low, and even the voice of a man who had taken many years to make peace with the sentence. "Every day," he said. "But I learned at some point that missing a person doesn't have to mean hurting. Sometimes it just means the love is still here. It has nowhere else to go." Victoria did not answer. She stood next to him at the railing and watched the tugboat until it had crossed the full width of her view and disappeared behind the building on the next block. 2 weeks into Elijah's quiet visits, the recordings began to fail again. Not all at once. They came back when Noah pressed the button, but the audio crackled now in places it had not crackled before. Some of the older clips skipped. One of them, the bedtime story about the fox who had lost his shadow, cut off 3 minutes earlier than it should have. Elijah noticed it before Noah did. He carried the robot back down to the dining room table where the towel had become a permanent fixture, and he opened it up again under the warm overhead light. What he found this time was harder to fix. The custom chip Claire had installed was beginning to degrade. The components she had used were not factory standard parts, and there were no replacements available on the open market. They had been chosen originally because they did one specific job extremely well, but they had not been chosen with replacement in mind. Whatever Claire had been building when she modified the robot, she had been building it for use, not for repair by a stranger. He explained this to Victoria that evening in her study with the door closed. "How long?" she asked. "I can't say with certainty. Could be weeks. Could be a single power cycle. The whole architecture could go quiet at any time." Victoria sat in the chair behind her desk for a long moment with her hands flat against the glass surface. For the first time in her professional life, she did not reach for the phone to call a team. She did not consider hiring a specialty firm. She did not even consider the option of trying to acquire the components on a private market. She looked across the desk at the man in the gray uniform and asked him plainly, "What do you need?" "Time," he said. "And honestly, ma'am, something I don't have. I need to understand how she designed this. The way it's wired, the way the redundancy is laid out, it's not just a hack. It's a system. If she left any record at all of what she was building, anything, schematics, notes, even rough sketches that would change what I can do." Victoria remembered the leather notebook on the desk in the closed room. She sat with the memory of it for a long time after Elijah went home that night. The notebook had been 6 feet away from her every day for 6 months. She had walked past the closed door twice a day. She had ordered Doreen in so many words not to disturb anything inside. She had told herself it was respect. She had told herself it was grief. She had told herself a number of things that she now, in the quiet of her study at almost midnight, recognized as a kind of avoidance dressed in better clothes. She went down the hallway. She opened the door. The notebook was where it had always been. She picked it up and brought it back to her study, and she set it down on the glass desk, and she opened the cover. Inside, in Claire's careful engineering hand, were dozens of pages of schematics, wire diagrams, component lists, cross-references, and scattered between the technical pages journal entries written to no one in particular. Some of them were dated as far back as 4 years ago. One of them, written about 6 months before the accident, contained a single sentence underlined twice. "If one day these things break, do not throw them away. Find someone patient enough to understand them." Victoria closed the notebook with shaking hands. She brought it down to Elijah the following morning. They spread the pages out on the dining room table together. They studied a particular schematic on page 41, a backup module that, according to Claire's notes, had been hidden inside the housing of the digital photo frame and was designed to activate only if the main recording array failed in a specific way. Elijah and Victoria looked at each other across the table. "It might be possible," he said carefully, "to bring the main system back up long enough to migrate everything to that backup module, but it's delicate. If anything goes wrong during the transfer, we could lose all of it at once." Noah was upstairs. He did not know they were trying. They tried that afternoon. Elijah connected a thin pair of leads from a small piece of test equipment he had brought up from the workshop. He followed the schematic. He worked for nearly an hour. And at the very last step, as he attempted to bridge the primary board to the secondary module, a small bright flicker of static jumped across the connection, and the robot, the photo frame, and the story clock all went silent at once. Every screen went black. Doreen, who had been standing in the archway, made a small sound and turned away. Noah, drawn by the silence, came down the stairs. He stood in the doorway of the dining room and looked at the dark devices on the table and at the 2 adults standing very still beside them. His face went white. "Mom," he said quietly. "Is she gone now?" Victoria did not answer at first because she could not. Something in her chest had collapsed inward, and the words she would have used in a boardroom were nowhere within reach. The thing about a woman who has spent her entire adult life behind a desk is that the desk teaches her a particular grammar of response, and that grammar does not include "I do not know," and "I am afraid," and "I am sorry." The grammar she had built her life on did not have the words for this hallway. She crossed the room and knelt down on the imported rug she had paid an obscene amount of money for, and she put her arms around Noah, and she did something she had not done since she was 15 years old. She cried. Not quietly, not professionally. The way a person cries when the wall finally goes. She cried because the robot was dark. She cried because she had used her job to hide from her grief. She cried because she had bought a penthouse and forgotten to live inside it. She cried because she had not asked her sister even once what she was building on her kitchen table. She cried because Noah was 7 years old and had been waiting 6 months for someone in her family to feel something out loud. Elijah lowered himself onto one of the dining chairs and put his head in his hands. He was a man who had spent 15 years making promises he could keep, and he had just in front of a child failed one. He understood Victoria's tears in a way the rest of the room did not. He also understood that this was not his moment to speak. I think what frightens us most about losing someone is not the loss itself. The loss happens once. What frightens us is the long, slow erosion that comes afterward, the way the memory of their voice begins to soften at the edges, the way you start to forget exactly how they laughed, the way the texture of them in your mind becomes a little thinner every season. You cannot photograph it, you cannot save it to a hard drive without fearing the hard drive will one day fail. And the people who spend their lives building small protections against that erosion, the people like Claire who sit at kitchen tables and quietly encode love into circuit boards, are some of the most overlooked heroes this country produces. They do not build monuments. They build small chips that contain bedtime stories, so that one day when they are no longer in the room, their child can still be tucked in by the sound of their voice. That night, 3 people sat in a quiet dining room with a robot that no longer spoke, a billionaire who had finally cried in front of a child, a maintenance man who had finally, for the first time since his wife's death, lost his certainty that he could fix anything that mattered, a 7-year-old boy who had run out of voices to call him home. No one in the room said anything for a long time. There was nothing useful to say. If you have ever stood next to someone in pain and not known what to say to them, I want you to remember this: you do not have to know. The person breaking next to you is not waiting for an answer. They are waiting to see whether you will leave. The single most valuable thing you can offer them, more valuable than any sentence you might rehearse, is the fact of your continued presence. Just stay. That is almost always enough. It was that night the only thing any of them had left to give each other. Elijah did not go home that night. He sat at the dining room table for nearly an hour after Victoria carried Noah upstairs, looking at the 3 dark devices spread out on the towel in front of him. The robot, the photo frame, the story clock. He had told the boy he could make it right. He had said the sentence out loud in a hallway in front of 3 engineers and a housekeeper and a woman who paid him to change light bulbs. He had believed himself at the time. He stood up, eventually gathered all 3 devices into the canvas tote he had brought up that morning, and asked Doreen, who was still in the kitchen, unwilling to leave, whether she would let Mrs. Hale know he was taking them down to the service-level workshop. He would work through the night if he had to. Doreen nodded without looking at him directly. He understood that she was not angry with him. She was simply like the rest of them, unsure what to do with so much grief inside one apartment. In the small concrete-walled workshop 3 floors below the lobby, he turned on the overhead fluorescence and set out Claire's leather notebook on the workbench beside him. Before he opened it, he took his phone out of his pocket and called home. Maya answered on the second ring. She always did, even at almost midnight. She was the kind of 9-year-old who slept lightly and worried more than she should. "Dad, where are you?" "Still at the building, baby. There's something I'm trying to fix for a little boy, and I'm not done yet." "Is he okay?" "He's very sad." She was quiet on her end of the line for the length of a breath. Then she said in her clear, careful voice, "Then stay with him, Dad." He thanked her. He told her to lock the deadbolt and go back to bed. He told her he would be home in the morning. He hung up and he stood at the workbench for a moment with both hands flat against the wood, and he thought about how his daughter at 9.5 years old already understood something most adults spend their entire lives failing to learn. He opened the notebook. He had not read it carefully before. He had been working from the schematics, the wiring diagrams, the component lists. Now, alone in the workshop with no one waiting for an answer, he began to read the journal entries woven between the technical pages. He read them slowly, in order the way you read a letter from someone you wish you had known. The entries were not addressed to Noah. They were not addressed to anyone in particular. They were the private working notes of an engineer who had been building something for someone she loved and had wanted for her own sake to write down what she was doing and why. There were sketches in the margins. There were corrections in different colored ink dated weeks apart. There was on a page about 2/3 of the way through a small drawing of a fox with a missing shadow. 3 pages later, Elijah found what he had been looking for. Claire had built 2 systems, not one. The primary system was the one everyone had seen the recordings, stored on the custom chip inside the robot, with secondary distribution into the photo frame and the story clock. But she had also built a 3rd layer that did not appear in any of the schematics shared between devices. A backup module smaller than a postage stamp hidden inside the housing of the digital photo frame behind the lens assembly. Independent power source, independent storage, designed to activate only if every other component in the system failed simultaneously. Above the drawing of the module in Claire's careful handwriting was a single sentence. Whoever finds this will have been patient enough to deserve to hear what is on it. Elijah read the sentence 3 times before he understood that he was crying. He wiped his face with the back of his wrist and went to work. At a few minutes past 3 in the morning, the workshop door opened. Victoria came in carrying 2 cups of coffee. She was wearing soft gray pants and a sweater that looked as though it had been pulled off the back of a chair without thought. Her hair was loose. She had not, Elijah realized, ever come down to this floor of the building before. The fluorescence made her look smaller than she did upstairs. She set one of the cups on the workbench beside him. She did not ask if she could stay. She pulled the old wooden stool over from the corner and sat down. For a long time, neither of them said anything. Elijah continued working one careful movement at a time. Victoria watched him work, which was something she had not properly done before. She had observed him. She had supervised him. She had not, until now, simply watched. She spoke first. Her voice was quieter than he had ever heard it. "I didn't know my sister was capable of any of this." Elijah did not stop working. He understood that the sentence needed somewhere to go, but not necessarily an answer. "I thought she was wasting herself," Victoria continued. "All those years? The degree? The job in Boston? I thought when she walked away from that company, she was throwing it away. I told her so, more than once." She looked down at her hands, which were holding the coffee cup, the way a person holds something just to have something to hold. It turns out she was using all of it for the only thing that ever really mattered to her. Elijah set down the small tool he was holding and looked at her across the workbench. "Mrs. Hale," he said, "talent is never wasted when it is used to love somebody." Victoria did not answer. She sat with the sentence the way a person sits with a piece of music after it has finished playing. After a while, she lifted the cup to her mouth and drank. "I have told this story to a number of people over the years, and I have noticed that almost everyone who hears it identifies the most moving moment as the moment the boy's mother speaks again. I understand why. The voice of a person who has died is in any culture the most powerful image we have for love that does not surrender. But the moment that has always stayed with me, the moment I find myself returning to when I think about this story late at night, is the moment a 9-year-old girl told her father over the telephone to stay with another child she had never met. There is something about that sentence that says more about how love actually works in this world than almost anything else I can think of. Maya did not know Noah. She had no claim on her father's time. She had every reason to ask him to come home, and at 9.5 years old, no one would have judged her for it. Instead, in the calm, slightly tired voice of a child who had already been taught what love looks like, she released her father to a stranger's pain. I think a great many adults go their entire lives without learning what Maya learned by the time she was 9. Love, when it is real, does not pull people toward you. Sometimes it sends them out into the dark to sit with somebody else. By the first soft gray of dawn, Elijah had the backup module in his hand. It was smaller than Claire's notebook had suggested. He set it on the workbench under the magnifier and confirmed the pin layout against page 62 of her notes. He cleaned the contacts. He connected it with the care of a man diffusing something he had built himself to a clean bypass channel he had cut into the robot's main board. He sealed the housing. He pressed the chassis closed with the palm of his hand. He looked up at Victoria. "I think it is going to work," he said. "But I would rather he be here when we try." Victoria went upstairs. She walked into Noah's room and sat on the edge of his bed and put her hand on his shoulder very gently and told him there was something he needed to come see. He sat up in his pajamas with his hair flattened on one side and his eyes still half closed, and he asked in a voice that was barely a voice, "Did he fix it?" "He says he thinks so. He wants you to be there." Noah did not put on slippers. He walked barefoot through the penthouse and into the service elevator with Victoria, and he did not say a single word the whole way down. In the workshop, Elijah had cleared everything off the workbench except the robot. He had laid a fresh white cloth under it. The overhead fluorescence had been turned down and a single warm desk lamp had been pulled close, the way you light a room for a person you are about to wake. Noah walked up to the bench. He looked at the robot. He looked at Elijah. "Press the button, son," Elijah said quietly. Noah reached out with both hands. He pressed the button on the robot's chest. There was a click. There was the small particular hiss of an old speaker warming up, and then Claire's voice came out of it clearer than any of them had heard it before, because this was the recording Claire had hidden inside the deepest layer of her work, the one Noah had never heard, the one she had stored where it would only ever be found by someone patient enough to look for it. "Noah, if you are hearing this, it means somebody worked very, very hard to keep me here with you a little while longer. Say thank you to that person for me. Please, and sweetheart, listen. I am not really gone, not as long as there is somebody in your life who loves you enough to listen." Noah did not cry right away. He stood very still and listened to his mother finish her sentence. Then he turned to Elijah and in the smallest possible voice he said, "Thank you." Then he turned around and ran to Victoria and wrapped both arms around her waist and pressed his face into her sweater and Victoria for the first time since the day she had picked him up from his elementary school 6 months earlier and told him in the parking lot that his mother was not coming home. Victoria sat down on the cold workshop floor in her expensive sweater and held him and let him cry into her without trying to fix any of it. Elijah stepped back from the workbench. He turned the desk lamp off. He stood at the edge of the small workshop and watched the woman he had been hired to work for hold her sister's son on the concrete floor, and he did not feel that he had won anything. He felt instead the strange, settled exhaustion of a man who has carried something heavy a long way and finally been allowed to set it down. Several weeks passed before the rest of the story arranged itself. Victoria opened the door to Claire's room and did not close it again. She left the leather notebook on the desk where it had always been, but she opened it to the page with the fox sketch, and she left the page facing up. Noah began to spend time in that room. Sometimes he sat at the desk and read his mother's handwriting. Sometimes he just sat on the rug. Down on the service level, the small workshop where Elijah had once changed light bulbs and rewired broken thermostats became something else. Victoria expanded it. She bought the 2 adjacent storage rooms from the building's holding company and had the walls knocked down. She had proper benches installed. She had cabinets built for tools. She had a sign painted on the door in plain black letters, "Claire's Workshop." The workshop did not take corporate clients. It did not generate revenue. It existed for one purpose, and one purpose only: to repair free of charge the small, irreplaceable objects that the children of struggling families in the city had been told to throw away. Toys with the voices of dead parents inside them, music boxes from grandmothers, cassette recorders, watches that did not keep good time anymore but had been worn on a wrist that mattered. Elijah was offered the position of director. The salary he was offered was the salary of a senior engineer, not a maintenance technician, because that was what he had been the entire time. And Victoria knew it now. He almost said no. He told her honestly that he could not take a job that would compromise his ability to be home when Maya needed him. Victoria had clearly anticipated this. She had already had a corner of the workshop set up with a small couch, a desk, and a reading lamp. Maya could come every afternoon after school. So could Noah. The two children between them had become inseparable in a way that neither of the adults had quite expected, and neither of them was inclined to interrupt. Victoria also did something quieter that did not make it into any press release. She established a scholarship fund in Claire's name for the children of the maintenance staff, the cleaning crews, the doormen, the security personnel of the building she had lived in for 11 years, and the other 3 buildings her company owned. The people whose names she had never bothered to learn. The fund was substantial. The application process was simple. The first year, 11 children received it. On a Thursday afternoon, late in the autumn, a young mother named Rebecca came into Claire's workshop carrying a stuffed bear in a plastic grocery bag. The bear was missing one eye and one of its arms had been torn at the shoulder seam. It had been her son's. Her son had died of leukemia 8 months earlier. He had been 6. She set the bag down on the workbench in front of Elijah, and she did not look at him. Everybody told me, she said I should just throw it away. They said keeping it was making it worse. Elijah took the bear out of the bag with both hands. He set it down on the workbench with the same particular care he had once used to set down a small blue-silver robot on a slab of imported marble 6 months and several lifetimes ago. "Ma'am," he said gently, "not everything that breaks has to be replaced." Through the workshop's small window in the courtyard between the buildings, Noah and Maya were sitting cross-legged on a bench together. Noah had the robot in his lap. The robot was talking. Claire's voice was very softly telling them the story about a fox who had lost his shadow and gone looking for it across 7 hills. Maya had heard the story before. She was listening anyway. There are people in this world who only need somebody gentle enough to figure out exactly where they are hurting. And there are things, small, scuffed, ordinary things, that turn out to be carrying more love inside them than anybody passing by ever guessed. The world keeps telling us to throw those things away because the world is in a hurry. But every so often, somebody refuses. Somebody sits down at a kitchen table or a workbench or a hospital bedside and decides that what is in front of them is worth understanding no matter how long it takes. If you remember nothing else from this story, please remember this. The next time you walk past somebody, the world has decided not to look at the man fixing the elevator, the woman mopping the floor, the quiet, uniformed person at the edge of a room you are paying to be in. Try just for a second to actually see them. Ask their name, meet their eyes. Because under that uniform almost always is a whole life you have never imagined. And one day when something in your own life breaks in a way nobody can explain, it may be one of those people and not anyone you have paid who turns out to be the only person in the room with the patience to fix it.